Hello everyone. Today's lesson focuses on one of the three most transformative concepts which I've studied as a guitar player. Now these are not especially complex or deep dive music theory concepts, but they're ones which once I understood them fully and integrated it into my playing, they pushed my playing forward in ways that I don't think anything else has done. They really form the mental framework in which I think about the guitar, and my aim with this video and subsequent videos is to teach them to you in the way that I wish I'd been taught. About 4 years ago, I took on the module leadership for the music theory degree modules at BIM where I teach, and with this I was suddenly teaching drummers and vocalists who had no experience of music theory whatsoever. And what this forces you to do is to reduce and distill ideas down to their simplest and most concise form, completely free of any kind of academic pomposity. So this is exactly how I'm going to be approaching today's subject, which is of course modes. This lesson is going to be pretty free from any kind of guitar pyrotechnics, and it's going to be a longer one, but I promise you that if this is an area that you've ever had any kind of confusion about, or perhaps just feel like you need a refresher, or maybe you don't understand it at all, I promise that you will feel more confident by the end of this video. So settle in, make yourself a drink, and yeah, follow me on this little journey into some really vital guitar theory. Okay, now I'm not assuming any kind of prior knowledge with this video, so we are going to recap a couple of fundamental steps to begin with, but even if this stuff is completely second nature to you, I urge you to stay with me until we get to the end. When it comes to Western music theory, ground zero really comprises of two concepts: the musical alphabet and the major scale. The musical alphabet is much like our English alphabet, apart from it only runs as far as G. If you imagine a piano, this would be the white keys. The black keys on a piano would be our accidentals. There are two main accidentals which we'll be dealing with today: sharps and flats. A sharp raises the pitch of a note by 1 fret or 1 semitone. A flat lowers it by 1 fret or 1 semitone. All accidentals have what is called an enharmonic equivalent, which sounds terribly fancy, but it's very simple. If we took C and we were to raise this note using a sharp, it becomes C sharp. If we looked at the next note, our next white key, D, and we were to flatten it, it becomes D flat. And you'll notice that both of those notes reside on the same fret, which is the 4th fret of the A string. You don't need to worry about it any more than that. Which name you use is determined by which key you're in, but essentially all we need to know is that they are two different names for the same sound. When it comes to memorizing the musical alphabet, it's perhaps easiest to try and remember which notes don't have accidentals, of which there are two most of the time. That is B and E. So we don't have a B sharp in most instances, and we don't have an E sharp in most instances. At that point, we simply move to the next white note, from B to C, or from E to F. Hence the name of Homer Simpson's barbershop quartet, the B sharps. Now, you can practice visualizing the fretboard in this way by simply choosing an open string, let's say D, starting the musical alphabet at that point, and then with every fret that you move up, you'll be moving up one place within the musical alphabet. So we'd have D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, and then at our 12th fret, we return to our starting point of D. Now you can do that on every string, and it will just help break you out of the mindset of thinking purely in terms of fret numbers and string names. And when you've spent a little bit of time doing that, I recommend that students then take things they already know, could be a riff, could be a chord voicing, whatever it is, and then work out what the name is of each pitch within that chord or idea. If you do that for a couple of minutes every day, you will be visualizing the whole fretboard as note names in no time whatsoever. This brings us to the major scale, arguably our most important scale within Western music. Now, often relegated as a necessary evil of learning an instrument, destined to be recited endlessly in our quest for mastery, the major scale is actually much more than this. It is where chords come from, it's where keys come from, it's where different types of scales come from, pentatonic scales, modes, arpeggios. But for a scale that can boast so much, it's very simple to generate, and it is done so through a simple formula of tones and semitones. Now, tones on a guitar are the distance of 2 frets, and a semitone is the distance of 1 fret, an adjacent fret. If we take the key of C as an example, we would have root, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. And we can do this on one string, root, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. And regardless of whatever note you start on, you will always generate a major scale in that particular key. So if I was to do the same thing from F sharp, root, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, you can hear that sound and the quality of the scale remains the same regardless of where we're starting. Now, there's a couple of simple rules we'll want to bear in mind here when we are creating major scales in different keys. And the first thing is that each letter of the musical alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, must be used once and only once. So in other words, when we are naming the notes within a scale, we are not going to be duplicating or omitting any of those fundamental letters. So for example, we will not see C and C sharp within the same scale. Instead, the second note would be labelled D flat, C and D flat, so that we are not duplicating or missing out one of those notes. The second rule is that in the case of the major scale specifically, we're never going to be mixing sharps and flats. We're only ever going to be using one or the other. So if I chose the key of B major, we would have B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B. You'll notice that all the accidentals are named as sharps. We don't have a mixture of both, because this is how we abide to our first rule of making sure we use every letter once. If I chose a different key, let's say A flat, B flat, C, D flat, E flat, F, G, A flat. You'll notice again, every accidental this time is named as a flat. So a little bit like our first exercise when we're learning the notes on the fretboard, we can practice major scales in a very similar way. We can stay on one string for the time being, pick a note at random, and then try to generate a major scale on that one string in that key. As you go through each note, make sure that you're naming it and make sure that you are not mixing sharps and flats, and that every letter gets used once and only once. Now, the major scale forms our basis for intervals. Technically, an interval is like a musical distance, like, a centimetre or an inch. But they also serve as the building blocks of music, or the atoms of music. And our major scale is our sort of global reference point for how we describe intervals. So, for example, the 7 notes of the scale would be labelled 1 through 7. If I wanted to describe the notes within a major chord, I would describe them as being 1, 3, 5, which means the first, third, and fifth notes of the major scale. But this fundamental system can be used to describe things of great complexity as well. So if I were to play something a little bit more complicated, I would still have the notes of the scale in there. I'd have my 1 or my 2 or my 3, but I might also have notes that have been altered in some way. For example, in this case, F sharp would be described as a sharp 4 or an augmented fourth, which means taken the 4th note of the scale and it's been raised by a half step. So no matter how complicated something is, we will always describe it relative to the major scale. And that is always in relation to the root note that you are playing or playing over at the time. So if I were playing a progression that moved from G to B minor, and I wanted to describe to somebody what I was doing at that point, even though I might have started on G, I'll be describing in relation to whatever your ear is kind of hearing in that moment. So I'd be looking at those notes in relation to the root note of B, which in that case would be 5/4 flat 3. So now that we understand the musical alphabet and how to construct major scales and how the major scale is used as our foundation for describing everything else, where do chords come from? Well, diatonic chords, and diatonic just means belonging to a key, come from harmonizing the major scale in thirds. And this is a really simple process. If we were to start with, again, C major, harmonizing the scale in thirds would mean that we start at the root, we skip over the second, and we take the third. We skip over the fourth, and we take the fifth. Okay, so in other words, we're taking every other note and then we are stacking them on top of each other. If we analysed all of those notes in relation to the root note of C, in terms of the distances of each note away from the root, we would see that we had a major third and a perfect fifth. Now this process can be repeated from each degree of the scale in turn. So we would next go to the second note of our C major scale, which is D, and we would apply the same process of taking a note, skipping a note, taking a note, skipping a note, taking a note, which would give us. Now, even though we're in the key of C at the moment, if we wanted to see what was going on and what type of chord this was, if you just didn't know instinctively, you'd be comparing it to the root of D, the lowest note in the chord. And if we were to look at those distances, we'd see that we had a minor third, i.e. the third note of the D major scale, but that has been lowered by half step, and we'd have a perfect fifth. Okay, that's a concept which might seem like a little bit confusing to you, because it was for me. I always used to think, well, you know, if I'm looking at the second chord within a key, why aren't I calling those notes 2, 4, and 6? Because we're in the key of C, right? Because we're always describing what is happening musically in relation to whatever the tonic is at the time. So if we were to repeat that process, starting from each note of the major scale in turn, where we're starting on that note, skipping over a note, taking the next one, etc., we would end up with the following chords in the key of C. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and B diminished. Now, the beautiful thing about music theory is that when we can establish a rule in one key, that rule applies to all the other keys. So what we can extract from this is the rule that if we harmonize a major scale, we always have the chord qualities of major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, appearing in exactly that sequence. And each one of those chord qualities aligns to each of those 7 notes in order. So if I were to take a different key, let's say D major, which gives me the notes D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and D, I could take that scale and then I could apply those chord formulas to those notes, which would give me D major, E minor, F sharp minor, G major, A major, B minor, and then C sharp diminished. And again, I advise that you practice doing that in lots of different keys. Start with the major scale, work out the 7 notes, and then apply those chord qualities over those notes. Okay, so if I were to create a chord progression drawing from the 7 chords within the key of C major, there's going to be a pleasing quality to it. And that's because all of these chords have come from the same place. They share the same DNA. I'll give you an example. Let's say we're going to take what I would call a 1, 3, 6, 4 progression, which means that of our 7 chords in C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, etc., we are assigning a number or a Roman numeral to each one of those chords, and we are extracting certain ones to build a progression. So in the key of C major, that would be C major, our 3 chord would be E minor, our 6 chord would be A minor, and our 4 chord would be F. I'll play that again. All sounds very nice, and it very much leads our ear back to C. If you're playing that at a gig, you'd probably find that everybody was hanging there waiting to clap until they heard C again, and they go, oh good, the song's over now. Okay, that's our point of resolution within that progression. But what happens if, without adding or taking away any chords from the key of C, we simply start our progression in a different place? Let's say, for example, we start on the 2 chord, which would be D minor, and we went to the 5, the 4, and then back to the 5 chord. How would that sound? Okay, now we haven't strayed out of the key at all. Our umbrella key is still C major, but because C major is nowhere to be found here, our ear is identifying a different chord as being home. We're now sensing that D minor is where the progression feels at rest. And what we're seeing here is the concept of tonal centers. We have keys. In this case, the key is C, but now our tonal center is D minor. Let's try another example. So this time, still within the key of C, using nothing but the chords in the key of C. I'm going to take the 5 chord, the 1, the 4, the 5, and then back to the 1. Any Guns N' Roses fans out there might recognize that one. But you can hear that our ear is very, very firmly identifying G as being our resting point in the progression. If you imagine ending that song, I feel like everyone at the gig would be rather confused. It'd be a bit like, okay. This is the thing to really get your head around, the difference between a key and a tonal center, what our ear is identifying as being home. If your chord progression isn't starting on the 1, well, you're writing a modal chord progression, and each one of those 7 chords within the key has an associated modal name. So in the key of C, we'd have Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixed Lydian, Aeolian, Locrian, and then back home again. So if we took those progressions from earlier, the first one I did started on D minor. Well, that's a Dorian chord progression because it's built from the 2. If I took the Paradise City progression, Well, it's a Mixolydian progression because it's built from the 5. So where do scales come into all of this? You might be asking yourself, okay, well, you know, all these progressions, they might start from a different place, but ultimately they're all from the key of C. So what's to stop me using a C major to improvise over any of these? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. But it does present a problem. When we start to think about music in terms of intervals, which is the way that I would push everyone gently towards, we learn that every interval has got a unique quality to it. Our root is always our strongest point of resolution. The perfect fifth has this kind of strong, majestic quality to it. And major seventh has this kind of interesting dissonance. And it's really this knowledge that arms us with having a much greater degree of control over what we're doing. A lot of our favourite session guys, it wasn't by chance that they were able to just come up with amazing parts on the fly in 1 or 2 takes. It's because they were schooled musicians and they understood the underlying theory of what they were doing. They didn't have to rely on kind of feeling their way through it necessarily, although unquestionably all of those guys had amazing feel, but they knew what they were doing, and they knew that when they leaned on certain intervals or put a certain extension into a chord, exactly what effect that was going to have. So this brings us back to modes. If we're in the key of C, but we're centered around D minor, and if you're thinking about everything as being, well, I can just play the C major scale over all of this, well, your understanding of intervals is going to be displaced, because if you are resolving your phrases to C, well, C is not home as far as your ear is concerned anymore. Remember that your ear is hearing D minor as being home. So when you play a C against a D minor, that's what happens. Does that sound resolved to you? No, it doesn't. It's because it's now functioning as a flat 7. Whereas if we take the 7 notes of C major, but we start them on D, it realigns our scale with our chord. They both drift back into alignment. So now your resolution points are where they need to be, as are all the other colourful intervals that you get out of the scale. Now, even though we're using the same notes, the effect of playing the C major scale but starting on D, it creates a new intervallic formula. Because if we take those 7 notes, still just using C, D, E, F, G, A, B, but we're starting on D, well, our major scale formula is root, tone, tone. But look what happens when we start on D. Root, tone, semitone. So immediately we've got a completely different type of scale emerging. And if we were to work out what all of these notes were in relation to the root note of D, we'd find that we had root, major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, minor seventh. Which is Dorian, and that's the sound of Dorian. Now, when you repeat this process, starting from each note within the scale in turn, it's always playing the 7 notes of C major, but playing them from E and then F, etc., you end up generating 7 different formulas, and this is the essence of modal scales. Now, remember that each chord within the key has an associated mode. So if we're in the key of G major, for example, but you are centered around, your song is in, has a tonal center of A minor, the 2 chord, well, your scale of choice is going to be A Dorian, the notes of G major, but starting and centering around the 2nd note of the scale, A, gives you A Dorian. If you were in the umbrella key of D major, but you were centered around the G chord, which is our 4 chord in the key of D major, well, G, Lydian would be the mode that you adopted. So what I hope you understand about this is that modes are all about context. There's often a little bit of misleading information that you can just kind of use them wherever. And in jazz, things are a little bit more flexible. But generally speaking, to draw out the sound of a particular mode, the context of the harmony underlying it needs to be right. Only in instances where you have very little harmony can you get away with changing between modes willy-nilly. If you're playing over just a D minor chord, sure, you could use D Dorian or D Aeolian or D Phrygian, because you don't have any other chords adding notes that contradict the scale that you're choosing. So how do we know which mode to use where? Well, it basically requires us to undertake a little bit of simple analysis, but thankfully we have a couple of clues within a key that can help us to situate ourselves. And those are as follows. Within a major key, there's only one place where we have two minor chords sitting next to each other within the musical alphabet, and that is on the second and third chord within the key. Likewise, we only have one place within the key where we have two major chords sitting next to each other on adjacent letters of the alphabet, and that is the 4 and the 5. And this can help you reverse engineer a progression to figure out what key you're in. So for example, if I had A minor, B minor, C, and G, I might say to myself, okay, well, do I have two major chords in this progression? Yes, I do. I have C and G. But are those notes next to each other in the alphabet? No, they're not. So as a clue, not very useful. But do I have two minor chords? Yes, I do. I have A minor and B minor. Are they next to each other in the alphabet? Yes, they are. Which means this is our 2 and our 3 chord within the key. And from there, we can work out if that's our 3 and that's our 2, our 1 is G. And we can then work out our progression is 2, 3, 4, and 1, which enables you to select the correct mode. In this case, if we're centered around A minor and we're in the key of G, it means that we're going to be using A Dorian. Okay, so I mean the chords won't necessarily appear next to each other within the progression. So you could have, for example, A minor, G, B minor, C. So you'd have to kind of mentally rearrange them into alphabetical order in order to see where those clues are really clearly. But you can get a long way with that type of simple analysis. And of course, things get a little bit more complicated where we see songs that are borrowing chords from other keys. But as an entry point into modes, this is a good place to start. So how do we go about organizing this information? Well, you could sit down with loads of scale diagrams and, memorize them off by heart like I did years ago to little positive effect. But I'm going to give you an alternative. You see, all of our major modes are built on the framework of the major pentatonic scale. Ionian, Lydian, and mixed Lydian all contain the intervals 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. All of them have that framework, which leaves 2 intervals left over. We have 4 and we have 7. And those 2 intervals are the only thing that change between each of those modes. Ionian has a perfect 4th and a major 7th. Lydian has a raised 4th and a major 7th. Mixed Lydian has a perfect 4th and a flat 7. So if you think about it in that way, there's a few things that are useful about this. One, you are building from the framework of something where a lot of your vocabulary is already based. Inevitably, so much of our vocabulary is based around pentatonic scales. So it means that rather than having to come up with loads and loads of new stuff, you can adapt the stuff that you already know to make it modal. The second thing that's really useful is that it's really highlighting those two characteristic intervals that differentiate one mode from another. So it means that you become hyper aware building these intervals into a pentatonic scale where they are, and then how much you lean on them is going to determine how modal your playing sounds. Now, exactly the same thing applies for the minor pentatonic scale, in that we have the framework of 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, and that exists within Dorian, Phrygian, and Aeolian. They all have those 5 intervals, and the 2 intervals that are left over there are, of course, the 2 and the 6, and those are the 2 notes that vary from mode to mode. Dorian has a major second and a major sixth. Aeolian has a major second and a minor sixth, and then Phrygian has a minor second and a minor sixth. So again, it kind of makes you hyper aware about where those intervals are. It goes without saying that Locrian is kind of in its own category, because this is technically a diminished mode. It has a flat fifth, so it doesn't fit quite so neatly within the kind of pentatonic framework. It sits alone, but we can think of it as simply being an altered minor pentatonic scale framework with a flat fifth. Now, my final word on this is organisation, which is, generally speaking, when we think about scale formulas, the more sharps a formula has, the brighter sounding the mode is going to be. The more flat something has, the darker it's going to be. So this means that we can quite neatly organise all of our modes. We can actually think about Lydian as being the brightest sounding major mode because its formula has 1 sharp in it. Ionian, or the major scale, is kind of our neutral sounding major mode. And then Mixolydian is the darkest sounding major mode because we have a flat within the formula. Likewise, with the minor modes, technically Dorian is our brightest sounding minor mode because we have the flat third and the flat seventh, only 2 flat intervals. Whereas with Aeolian, we have 3 flattened intervals, the third, the sixth, and the seventh. And then with Phrygian, we have the addition of a flat second as well. So there is a lot of information there, but ultimately this is kind of how I wish that I'd been taught modes, because I feel it would have helped me so much more with understanding where and when to use modes, and in what context, and how to identify the context, but also how to organize them, how to think about them intervallically speaking, and also how to integrate them more successfully into my existing vocabulary rather than learning them from scratch and ultimately doing loads of stuff that just sounded like scales. Okay, folks, I really hope that you got something useful out of this. Please let me know in the comments whether you did, or if this is a subject that you've struggled with in the past, or maybe you have a completely different way of thinking about it, but I'd love to hear about it. If you're enjoying these lessons, please consider joining me on Patreon to support me making more of these videos, and you'll also get a few cool extras like some monthly additional lick lessons called Top Draw Licks, as well as some other advice and behind the scenes stuff. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and allowing notifications so you can see when new videos are posted. And for you guys who are already subscribers, thank you for your support. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you guys really soon. Okay, take care. Bye everyone.